I'm so looking forward to this conversation because, as we just said a minute ago, heart health really isn't a sexy topic. And I think we're greatly underestimating the impact it has on our lives.
I agree. Completely agree.
I would love to start by asking you, like, just a little bit about yourself. And I love the content you share, and it's so nice to see this like space of evidence-based, rational health professionals and academics opening up online because it's just chaos o'clock these days on the internet. But what got you interested in nutrition? Because nutrition is not really one of those careers where you're like at 6 years old. I'm like, oh, I saw the dietitian or like researcher on TV. I want to do nutrition.
Yeah, so I grew up playing basketball, and that was, sports was kind of my intro into the health space. I got into in college. I was doing a degree in exercise science. Nutrition is obviously a part of that. Started lifting weights and stuff, and started changing my own nutrition. Honestly, when I moved out at 18, like the first time I went grocery shopping, I knew nutrition mattered. Like it was at that point that I didn't buy the same stuff that I was used to eating. I bought like some apples and bananas and I didn't eat those things before, but I just intuitively knew that it mattered to some degree. I didn't know how much. And I modified my nutrition throughout undergrad, graduate school, like when I was in college, like mainly for body composition purposes. Started following like bodybuilding blogs and things like that, and gained a bunch of muscle. Developed some health issues when I was doing my master's degree, so developed some digestive issues. Was put on some medication that made it worse, and asked the doctor like, "Does nutrition matter?" And they're like, "Oh, you're a healthy guy. Like your nutrition doesn't matter." Um, I started looking at nutrition from a different perspective at that point. I was like, well, maybe I'm pretty sure nutrition plays a role because everything I eat goes into my gut. Like it has to be playing some type of role. So I started looking more into nutrition from like a health standpoint. Okay, what do I need to try to do to see if I can improve this digestive issue? I was able to improve it pretty quickly within the first couple of months. And I was dealing with this for months before that and taking medication, going to doctor's visits, spending money, being terrified, And so that was a switch for me where I got really obsessed. I'm kind of an obsessive person. I was kind of like that with exercise science before. And as soon as I went through that experience, like I tried to read everything I could possibly get my hands on when it comes to nutrition. So I read lots and lots of books. I had a little bit of a background in nutrition because I had taken some classes, but I didn't have a really strong like scientific understanding of everything. And I read a whole bunch of books at that time, which, as you know, books are going to be extremely misleading for the most part. Like almost every book that's a New York Times best-selling book is filled with misinformation. And so I read all these books and kind of, learn quote unquote about nutrition from popular nutrition sources. And this is one of the reasons also why I can relate to a lot of this because I read blogs and books and things like that before I went into formal education. So I started taking courses in graduate school, started looking at different options where I could go for a PhD, ended up getting accepted into a PhD program. I had to do a lot of catch up when it comes to nutrition. Took a lot of courses like nutritional biochemistry and things like that to kind of get up to speed with things. But I read everything I could possibly get my hands on for a long period of time, and that was mainly because my own personal experience, where uh, I realized that this is probably one of the most underutilized like forms of quote unquote healthcare that there is, and so that was like I was on a mission to try to help people utilize this in an effective way to improve health.
And it's so interesting because I think your origin story in nutrition mirrors a lot of people's origin story, with the difference being that so many people have a health issue. Your origin story mirrors so many others. They have a health concern, they don't get the answers. And like as a gastro RD, the amount of times gastroenterologists have told their patients that nutrition doesn't matter, it's just like, it's a thorn in my side. And, so they go and they look for answers because they're like, something's not right in my body. there has to be a way. Nutrition could be a way. And so they read all those popular sources, but then they go after they've transformed their health and they start spewing that misinformation to everyone else where you're like, wait a second here. I'm an academic. Like, let's take an academic approach to this. Like, let's get my PhD. Like, let's actually look deep into the science and share that with folks, which is so nice.
Well, at first I was probably on the other side of things of like, this is bad, and of all the books that I read. But yeah, definitely, I am eternally curious individual. So yeah, I definitely wanted to learn as much as I possibly could, and that's where, during my PhD, I saw the importance of nutrition for health, and I also saw that it was important for what we want to talk about today, which is like cardiovascular and metabolic health. And that's what I focused on during my PhD, because I saw that that was like the biggest need. We have heart disease is the number one killer, and type 2 diabetes rates are increasing pretty significantly, especially among younger age groups. And it's like nutrition is really, really important for these conditions, can really prevent a lot of these cases of diabetes and heart disease. And so that's what kind of led me during my PhD to focus on cardiovascular and metabolic health, because from a public health standpoint, these are the things that we really need to be improving the most.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point to highlight. It is the number one kill. Like, we talk about so many things on the internet. We're talking about like leaky gut and like chronic inflammation, all these kind of things, and we forget that. Wait a second, guys. Like, the one thing that we're not talking about is actually the thing that we're dying from the most. And I want to break that down a little bit. Like, when we talk about heart health, what do we mean? Like, we think about our heart, but like, what other parts of our body are contributing? Is it the heart itself? Are we talking about our blood vessels? Like, what all sort of like fits into this mix?
Yeah, so when we talk about, so I usually, when I don't use the word heart so much, I usually use the term cardiovascular because it's more accurate. Because that means our heart and blood vessels. So cardiovascular health or heart health, most people just say heart, but we're talking about our heart and our blood vessels. And this is the transportation system of our body, the highway system of our body, essentially. So the heart is pumping blood through these blood vessels, and these blood vessels are taking the nutrients and the everything that we need, the oxygen, the nutrients, for our tissues to sustain themselves, and dropping that stuff off, and then picking up waste product and taking it away, and helping to get rid of it. It's pretty cool what this system does, and that's why it's so important, because it's how things move about throughout our body, and how oxygen and nutrients and everything gets delivered, and waste products get removed, or part of the way the waste products get removed. There's other ways as well, but that is really important for our health, for every reason, because if that transportation system is blocked up, it's like traffic that occurs. So if you have a development of a plaque, then there's less room for that blood to flow through, and that gets backed up. Your blood can not flow as well. There's less delivery of oxygen. There's less delivery of nutrients, and then sometimes that plaque can break off and cause a complete blockage. And if you completely block the flow of blood in your body, you will not live. And so that's why it's really problematic, because over time, these blood vessels start to become more, there's less room for blood to flow in there, and that can lead to um, lots of health issues, and then also potentially, a cardiovascular event, heart attack, death, a little bit later on.
Yeah, and it's so important to think, because we talk about so many of these systems and silos. Like, we talk about our cardiovascular system, we talked about our digestive system, we talk about our endocrine system, and it makes it really easy to forget that all of this is connected. It's like, oh, you're curious about like having more energy. Well, like, how do we get energy? Like, our cardiovascular system is pumping those nutrients, that nutrition, and also that oxygen through our body. Like, that's important for how energized you feel. Like, our entire body is working together. So even if you're just like, oh, well, my heart, I'm like 29, who cares? We're just like, well, no, our cardiovascular system is like important for all of us. Let's talk risk factors then, because oftentimes, like, a heart attack or a stroke is sort of like the end game. Like, that's the end event. And there are a lot of things that lead up to it. Like, there are risk factors in terms of heart health or cardiovascular disease. What are the important ones for us to know? Because, and this will sort of like feed into a little bit of misinformation on the internet that I want to talk about. But like, there's a lot of back and forth about things like cholesterol, for example.
Mhm.
So, like, how important are the risk factors when we're looking at cardiovascular health?
Yeah, so that's why these are established risk factors. That's why we measure them in the blood. That's why your doctor is measuring them. These are probably the most important things when it comes to our cardiovascular health, but overall health is the things that we were talking about: HbA1c, so blood sugar, um, triglycerides, which is the amount of fat in our blood. So sugar and fat, we don't want too much energy overall in our blood circulating during the fasted state, and then LDL cholesterol is another important risk factor for cardiovascular disease, and then blood pressure. So these are really some of the main ones when it comes to heart disease. If you're controlling all of those, you are going to be minimizing your risk based on the data that we have, and that's why these are measured. Because as we talked about at the beginning, heart disease is still the number one cause of death. Almost half of the population is going to die from heart disease, and so that's why these risk factors are measured as a part of like standard lab work. And blood pressure, that's measures the amount of resistance that's occurring in our blood vessels. And when pressure is very high, that means that it's putting more stress on the heart. So the heart's having to um, do more work to pump the blood and pump oxygen throughout the body. And for that reason, that can lead to heart failure. So we want to avoid having high blood pressure for that reason. Cholesterol, those cholesterol particles, and this is a major source of misinformation online, but LDL cholesterol does build up and cause a plaque. So what we just discussed a second ago, where there can be a buildup of where it's blocking blood flow, that is cholesterol that's gone into this artery, that's basically entered the artery wall, and that's been oxidized, and the immune system has created this plaque on top of it. And so that doesn't happen without cholesterol. So very high levels of cholesterol increase your risk of developing these plaques and of heart disease, and that's why it's an important risk factor. When you see information online telling you not to pay attention to LDL cholesterol, understand that that person is doesn't care about your health. Like the data is extremely clear here. Like there's no question about it. Like when LDL cholesterol, specifically, there's another marker called ApoB, which is the number of LDL cholesterol particles that we have circulating in our blood. That is when that's higher, that you're at increased risk of heart disease, and so we really want to pay attention to that one. Triglycerides is another one. That one's largely dependent on overall body weight, and then also the amount of refined carbohydrates that you're eating. If you're eating a lot of sugar, a lot of refined carbohydrates, typically triglycerides are going to be a little bit higher. And then blood sugar, HbA1c, that's just overall marker of uh, it's a marker of overall metabolism, in my opinion, because if your blood sugar is higher, that means you're not processing that sugar very well, and it means you're probably your body's not able to process the calories that you're giving it.
Yeah. I want to zoom into the cholesterol discussion a little bit, HDL and ApoB, and because the folks who do say LDL doesn't matter here, eat nothing but meat and cheese all day, your LDL will go up, but it won't matter because you're not eating seed oils. Seed oils cause oxidative damage and inflammation, and it's the oxidized LDL particles that you care about. Can you speak a little bit to the science of this? Or, I mean, on their part, the lack of science of this.
Yeah, so the oxidized LDL particles are the ones that contribute to the development of a plaque, but there's absolutely no evidence that seed oils contribute to oxidation of LDL cholesterol. And if you're switching from seed oils, let's say, for example, you're having canola oil and you switch that to butter, you're going to have more particles floating around in your blood. And the way that LDL cholesterol works is so let's think, you can think of it like a highway. So you're, as I mentioned a second ago, our blood is our transportation system. What LDL cholesterol is, our car is driving around. Every LDL cholesterol particle is a car. If you have more cars, there's more likelihood of accidents, period. That's just the way that it works. You want less cars on the road so that there's a lower likelihood of accidents occurring. And when you're eating more saturated fat, that's going to lead to a higher number of those LDL particles circulating in our bloodstream. And the reason that it does this, because you'll hear people say, oh, well, cholesterol doesn't increase, dietary cholesterol doesn't increase the cholesterol in our blood. It's not dietary cholesterol from the animal foods that's causing it. It's the saturated fat and also the lack of fiber. So the saturated fat increases, or it reduces our liver's clearance of cholesterol from the blood. So when we eat more saturated fat, it tells our liver to put out more ApoB containing lipoproteins, which are LDL cholesterol particles, because the liver thinks that it has to be transporting a lot of fat. So it's putting out more particles to help transport all that fat. And so it's putting out more of these. And for, I don't know why, we don't really understand this, but for some reason, saturated fat drives that more than other types of fat. And so saturated fat, particularly palmitate, which is found in animal foods, in pretty much all animal foods, is going to drive that increase in LDL cholesterol. So when we eat more, we're going to have more of those cars on the road, more particles floating around in our blood, and that's going to increase your risk. Now, that doesn't mean you have to avoid all saturated fat. There's a threshold. So it seems to be like over 7% to about 10% is where there's not really a major impact on LDL cholesterol. And then once we eat beyond that, it starts to impact LDL cholesterol. Now, this is also largely dependent on genetics. So this is where a lot of these things can get, it's easy to mislead people on this, because you just forget the nuance, because this is also largely dependent on genetics. So some people can eat really high amounts of saturated fat and have very little impact on their LDL cholesterol. And so you'll see some of these people who are carnivore diet, who are carnivore diet proponents, and they're eating very high levels of saturated fat, and they're saying, look, my LDL cholesterol is only 130 or 140. It's not that high. I mean, it's high, but it's not like extremely high. And they'll say, it really isn't that big of a deal. But the reality is that they probably just have really good genetics. Like my LDL cholesterol is at 130 if I'm, eating any amount of saturated fat for the most part, and it will go up very quickly as soon as I eat more saturated fat. But I have a very strong family history of heart disease, and everybody in my family has high cholesterol for the most part. And so, like, there's genetic component to it, and then there's also, what we're looking at when it comes to saturated fat and how it's increasing those particles and making more particles float around in the blood. That's really the problem.
I love that analogy of the idea of that, like, if you put more cars on the road, you're going to have more accidents. And, and particularly to hear from you, because, I'm plant based and I have a lot of plant based, nutrition folks on the podcast. And so I think the expectation can be that there is a bias that I say, well, obviously, saturated fat from animal foods is not going to be good for you. But that is the current evidence, even for omnivores.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I have a whole podcast on this. I mean, dairy fats don't seem to increase LDL cholesterol, but fat from every other animal source increases LDL cholesterol. Now, with that said, coconut oil and palm oil also do as well. So those plant-based sources, those are the only two plant-based sources of saturated fat that can increase LDL cholesterol.
Yeah, yeah, that's so important to mention. And the other thing that I wanted to talk about, because we talked about, in the sort of highway analogy, the idea that the blood can also provide the cleanup crew and carry the cleanup crew. And we haven't really spoken to like HDL cholesterol yet. Like, how does that fit into this whole thing?
Yeah, so HDL cholesterol, like you said, is a cleanup crew. And so HDL cholesterol helps to kind of shuttle cholesterol back into the liver for elimination. Um, so a lot of the people in the carnivore diet community in the low carb space will say, it's okay that your LDL cholesterol is high because your HDL cholesterol is also high. And this is very misleading, because as you just mentioned, it's a cleanup crew. And the only reason you need more of a cleanup crew is if there's more accidents. Like that's why you would need more HDL, is if there's more LDL, there's more cholesterol deposition throughout the body that the HDL needs to clean up. So having high HDL is actually not a good thing in the context of having high LDL. And there's studies that have demonstrated this. Um, Outside of that context, higher HDL, but this is largely genetic as well. Like just genetically having higher HDL seems to be protective against heart disease because it's serving a better function in terms of cleaning up some of that LDL cholesterol. But in the context of having high LDL, there's no advantage to having a high HDL because it's just there um, to clean up the excess that's occurring from the high LDL cholesterol.
Yeah. And this is probably the perfect point then to circle back to what you had initially said about fiber. Because if we can think of, so like the LDL, like, oh, your excess of, saturated fat, the LDL is going to carry that through your body. HDL is going to do its best to try and clean that up, but fiber plays a role here too.
Yeah, and fiber plays a cool role because fiber helps to eliminate some of that cholesterol. And so when you're eating more fiber, that's going to help eliminate some of that cholesterol and reduce your LDL cholesterol level. And it does that because it binds to bile in our intestines. And so fiber never even gets absorbed into our body. What happens is bile is used to digest fat, and our body uses LDL cholesterol to make bile, or it uses cholesterol to make bile, which it pulls from LDL particles. So our body is using cholesterol to make bile. It's dumping that into the intestines. Normally, that would be reabsorbed. A good portion of that bile would be reabsorbed and would go back to the liver. But if you're eating a high fiber diet, a lot of that fiber or a lot of that bile is eliminated, and that forces the liver to use cholesterol to make more bile, which it pulls from the bloodstream. So fiber, through this, through this backhanded mechanism, forces the liver to take cholesterol out of the bloodstream because it binds to bile, which is made out of cholesterol. So the liver has to make more bile, and it uses cholesterol to do so.
And this makes this sort of the perfect place to shift into this, sort of practical side of things that, if people can listen to the science and be convinced, they're like, okay, I get it. So I want my LDL to not be high. How do I do that with diet? Like, how do I begin to do that? In terms of saturated fat, you mentioned like, 7 to 10%, trying to maintain your saturated fat at that or below. What does that look like? Because like the vegan diet is a lot easier, but when you're an omnivore, when you enjoy all these things, chicken, red meat, eggs, dairy, what does that look like on a daily basis? Like what foods are you trying to maybe not eat daily and on a weekly basis versus like what's okay to eat daily?
So on an omnivorous diet, the recommendation would be to just choose leaner protein sources. So if you're choosing beef, go for the leanest beef you can. If you're choosing chicken, go for chicken without the skin, the chicken breast. Same thing with like turkey. Same thing with dairy. With the eggs, you can use a yolk or two, but not use all of them because eggs will increase cholesterol as well. A lot of people have misleading ideas around that. I can't tell you how many times I've said animal fats increase cholesterol, and people say, "What about eggs? I heard they don't." They do. That they still do. I don't know why that's like a thing. But so really just avoiding some of those fat sources as much you can, and adding in plenty of fiber. Now, this doesn't mean you can't have a fattier steak or something, on a weekly basis, as you mentioned. But doing that on a daily basis is in almost every case going to lead to an increase in LDL cholesterol. Now, what I typically recommend for people is to first get your cholesterol tested and see where you're at and see if you need to go down. Because I've worked with people who eat a omnivorous diet, they don't even pay attention to reducing their saturated fat intake, and their LDLs at 80. And it, again, it's just there's a big genetic component to this. And so, really looking at where you're at now and saying, okay, am I high with my LDL cholesterol? If you are high, reduce your consumption of these fattier animal foods, go for leaner animal foods, go for low fat dairy, go for egg whites, go for lean chicken, beef, turkey, all of those things. uh, Seafood is a good option there as well. And so focusing on those things, and then increasing your fiber consumption. So what I typically, one of the easiest ways to reduce your cholesterol is just replace fattier meat with some lentils or beans or some high fiber protein source. So most plant based protein sources are going to come with a lot of fiber. So if you're, like for example, some people will make, like tacos with ground beef. So you can replace half of that ground beef with beans, and that's going to make that small change will make a pretty big difference on LDL cholesterol, because you're replacing saturated fat source with the high fiber source, and that's going to be a pretty big difference. And so those little things like that can make a big difference. And like I said, really focusing on those leaner meats, and then really trying to get as many high fiber plant foods into your diet as you can.
I love that you shared that tip because people might not expect, but I work with omnivorous clients all the time. Like we don't just see plant-based clients in our practice. And, for people, particularly when families are like, oh, my kids, I don't know about my kids. And the 50-50, like that's what our grandmothers were doing when money was tight and they couldn't afford to feed everybody with a standard portion of meat anyways, which was like such a big part of our sort of like culinary history. And like doing that 50-50 and like adding that to chili, adding that to tacos is going to save you money and then instantly decrease your saturated fat and increase your fiber. Like it's a no-brainer.
Yep, yep. And I like lentils. Like if you have canned lentils, and you can just add those into so many different things, and they don't really impact the taste. So I've been doing that. So my son's a vegetarian. I am not. And so I know how to construct a plant-based diet pretty well, and I have been before, for long periods of time. I've been vegetarian, vegan. I've gone through different, phases, but I add lentils to a lot of things now, and it's just like I make spaghetti, and I just put a bunch of lentils in there, and he doesn't even know it's in there. He's never even mentioned anything about it. And I just started doing this in the last like 6 months or so, and lentils are great. They're high in iron, which is something that can be difficult to get as a someone who follows a plant-based diet. So that's a really easy strategy, is really just adding lentils, beans if you have them canned. Adding them to different meals is really, really simple.
Yeah, I'm a vegan in a family of omnivores, but I'm also the cook, so it's the same. So I'm sort of doing the opposite. I'm trying to take these like plant-based staples and then, up that umami and try and get those flavors that I know my like meat and dairy eating family wants.
Oh, that's
So
tough. I get
we're
that.
me.
Sounds harder than my situation.
I feel like at this point I've got it dialed, like better than bullion is one of my secret weapons. I can't live without it for building umami. But you mentioned seafood. And so I want to sort of like venture into this omega-3 territory
Mhm.
in terms of, so much research came out suggesting that omega-3s and particularly omega-3 supplements, EPA, DHA, were going to be important for heart health, important for inflammation. Like, what is in terms of where the research is sort of netted out now, what's your take on eating seafood like fatty fish as a source of long chain omega-3 fatty acids and or taking supplements?
Yeah. So first, let's talk about the omega-3 thing, because there's so much misinformation around that. Um, and in my opinion, around that is I think that comes from the fact that they just tried to turn omega-3 into a pharmaceutical, and as opposed to understanding that it's a nutrient that some people need if they're not consuming enough of it, and it can be important if you're not getting enough to meet those nutrient needs, but it's not something that we need to blast high doses of as a pharmaceutical. And that's where I think some of the negative press around omega-3 supplements has come about, because I've heard that. And even anytime I recommend omega-3s, like I'll talk about it, people will say, oh, the research doesn't support that anymore. I saw these studies, and I always get pushback on this. And it's because the research doesn't support omega-3 as a pharmaceutical medication for people who are in primary prevention of heart disease. So someone who had a heart attack, it doesn't work as a pharmaceutical for preventing their second heart attack. But that doesn't mean that omega-3 supplements are useless. It means that it's this not going to be a pharmaceutical medication that gets approved by the FDA, essentially. So omega-3 fatty acids, particularly as you mentioned, the long chain omega-3 fats, so EPA and DHA, these are important nutrients for our health. DHA is important for brain health. EPA is important for anti-inflammatory signaling, so basically preventing excessive inflammation. And so if we're not getting enough of these, that can have negative health effects. So there's lots of data looking at blood levels of omega-3s, and people who have low levels of blood levels of omega-3s have higher rates of inflammatory conditions, have higher rates of heart disease. And so we want to prevent those low blood levels of EPA and DHA. The only way to do that, or the best way to do that, is to consume fatty fish, because they have the EPA and DHA. When we consume omega-3 foods that are not fatty fish or algae, we're going to be getting the parent compound, which is ALA. And ALA is not converted very well in our body to EPA and DHA, which are the active forms that we need. So I have a whole podcast episode on this because it gets really complicated.
Okay, we'll link to
But
that because we
but
need it.
essentially, ALA gets turned into EPA and DHA, which are important in our body, and the amount of conversion is just dependent on genetics, like everything else. And so we don't necessarily know, like, if you can meet your needs with just ALA. And so, if you're just eating plant based sources of omega 3 fats like flaxseed and chia seed, which I highly recommend, there's lots of health benefits to consuming these foods. And I eat flax seeds every single day. I eat chia seeds on a regular basis. Like, I put this stuff into all of my son's food. I eat ALA because some of that is going to get converted into EPA, some of that's going to get converted into DHA, but we don't know if it's enough to actually meet your baseline needs. So, from that perspective, I do think that it is important, especially for certain groups like pregnant and breastfeeding women and developing children, to make sure that you're getting your DHA from somewhere, because ALA can be converted into EPA to a higher degree than DHA. DHA is the one that really, when we're eating plant based sources, probably not going to be getting enough DHA. And unless you're consuming algae, or taking an algae supplement, or that's really the main way to do that if you're following a plant-based diet, is to take an algae supplement to make sure that you're getting that DHA. For people who are following an omnivorous diet, if you're consuming fatty fish a couple of times per week, you're going to be getting plenty of DHA. I still recommend consuming plant-based sources of ALA, because some of that's going to get converted into EPA, and that's going to give you some EPA and DHA. Plus, things like flaxseed and chia seed come with a lot of other micronutrients and fiber. There's really no plant-based sources of ALA that aren't nutritious. So I highly recommend consuming omega-3s from fats. But if you're plant-based, maybe trying to supplement with the algae supplement. And again, I talk about this a lot more in my podcast episodes, so I can't go into too much detail here because it would take too long. But and then if you're omnivorous and you're not consuming fatty fish a couple times per week, it may be worthwhile to take a fish oil supplement. And the recommendations that I typically make around supplementation is a lot lower dose than what you tend to see, in some of the studies that are published, because in a lot of these studies they're just using really high doses, and it's just not, um, in my opinion, based on my evaluation of the research. And this is a really gray area. There's probably people with different opinions, but in my opinion, there seems to be benefit when people who are deficient are given omega-3 supplements to make sure that they meet their level of sufficiency in those nutrients. And so when we do, unfortunately, when we do supplement trials, we don't screen people based on their omega-3 intake or their omega-3 blood levels. We just take everyone and give everyone a supplement. And chances are that, 40% of that population doesn't need omega-3 supplements at all. And so they're kind of washing out the results. And so that's my opinion, based on reading this research quite a bit, is like, in trying to make sense of it all, is like, okay, it's helpful if someone is, has insufficient levels because they're not consuming enough or their blood levels are low.
Yeah. And it's really helpful that you mentioned too, pregnant women, because I think in terms of pregnancy, it's crystal clear to most people that prenatals are important, but I think vitamin D and DHA get lost as also the other critical nutrients. And I think it's like 200 to 300 milligrams of DHA every single day, which, yeah, if you are plant-based, you can get from algae.
Choline also gets overlooked as well.
Oh my gosh. Can you come back and can we just talk about choline for a whole hour? Because I
So,
think,
so for plant-based reasons, definitely
yeah,
choline, supplementation wise, definitely gets overlooked for prenatal.
yeah. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about, like, since we've sort of like gone into the omega-3 supplement area, is supplements in general. Like, are there any other supplements with respect to heart health that you think actually move the needle, or are there none, or are there, on an individualized basis based on, someone's dietary pattern, they might need this. So, are there any supplements you're like, I'm really curious about this for heart health?
There's nothing really major that moves the needle in terms of heart health. Maybe potentially magnesium if you're deficient, but when it comes to supplements, I always recommend that the first things people should be thinking about is replacing any nutrient deficiencies or insufficiencies. So a lot of people are looking for this herb or this lion's mane tea, or all of these different uh weird supplements that aren't really, like, it's not something that you would be consuming in your diet regularly. It's not a nutrient that your body needs. It's just something that a supplement company came out with that they knew they could sell with whatever claims, because that's not a highly regulated industry. Really, I always recommend just focus first on, are there nutrients? Because you just mentioned vitamin D for a lot of people. People aren't consuming enough vitamin D. Magnesium is a really important one that a lot of people aren't consuming enough of. Omega 3 fats is another one that a lot of people aren't consuming enough of. And then sometimes a lot of people can just benefit from taking a multivitamin just to cover a lot of those bases, in my opinion. So, like, uh, sometimes and especially if you track your calories for a little bit, and you track your food intake, and you look at your micronutrient intake, maybe you see, okay, I'm not consuming B6 on a regular basis, and I'm not consuming enough zinc on a regular basis. And if you're seeing that, then it may be helpful to just take like a low dose of a multivitamin to make sure you're meeting those nutrient needs, because that's the most important thing. People are trying to take a mushroom supplement. They don't have enough vitamin D in their system, and that's what they need in order to, really improve their health and well-being. And so, nutrients are first, and then outside of that, there's not a lot that has major benefits. There's definitely nothing in terms of heart health outside of potentially magnesium and replacing a deficiency, or fixing a deficiency or insufficiency in magnesium.
I love that you said that, because we're always looking for the most like glittery, esoteric thing and completely ignoring the foundation of what makes us healthy. It's like, oh, I'm so exhausted all the time. Like, let me take 10 different supplements. It's like, so how are you sleeping? Oh, I sleep like 4 hours a night. You're like, well, could we
Yeah.
talk about sleep? Could we maybe focus there and save you like $300 a month?
Exactly. Yeah. That ends up being a lot of the client work, the actual meetings with clients. It's like, sometimes people are looking for the next supplement, and it's usually something obvious. The low-hanging fruit is usually not that complicated. It's going to be sleep, it's going to be lack of activity, too much stress, not eating in a regular pattern. That's what a lot of people end up doing. Oh, my energy's, I have no energy. And it's like, we had, your meal consumption is just completely random, and sometimes you have these small meals in the morning, and sometimes big meals, and sometimes you skip food. And it's like, get into a pattern of eating so that your body has a consistent source of energy, and that can make a big difference for a lot of people. It's so simple, and it sounds simple to us because we
Mhm.
see it all the time, and we were able to see it from a a different point of view. But that's where health comes in. It's not the magical supplement. It's not any of these magical dietary patterns. It's really those obvious things: sleep, stress management. The major things when it comes to our nutrition: are you eating regular meals? Are they balanced? Are they or do you have a vegetable in there, and maybe some fruit and things? And when you get those things in place, typically a lot of those issues resolve.
Yeah, and they're the things that are simple to say, but they're not easy, right? That consistency and that consistent attention to these basics. The whole reason why we search for other, like just give me a supplement, just give me a pill, is because it's a lot easier to just like remember to pop a pill at 9 a.m. versus like, oh, did I do my meal planning this week? Like, did I make sure that I like bought enough vegetables and then like chopped the vegetables and like cooked all these things? Like, we recognize as health professionals that these things take effort, and there are so many demands on our time and our attention, but you'll save yourself so much money and really change your health if you can like get back to these sort of foundational basics.
Hmm.
I want to talk, I feel like one of the reasons why I'm interested in heart health is that unlike so many other areas, there are these very sort of clear nutrient outcome connections in the research. And we've talked about so many of them already. We've talked about saturated fat and omega 3s and fiber, but we have not touched on sodium yet
Hmm.
in terms of blood pressure and how it affects cardiovascular health. What's your advice around sodium, particularly vis-a-vis the trend that I'm seeing? I mean, folks in the keto community with increased sodium needs, but like the element thing just gets like, I just did a post about it a couple weeks ago and I had so much hatred that I would deign to say maybe we all shouldn't be consuming thousands of extra milligrams of sodium a day. So what's your take?
I 100% agree with you there. I can't tell you how many times I've addressed that one. The general population doesn't need to be eating more sodium. The average person, 90% of the population is eating um, too much sodium, and that's largely from processed food. So if you're not eating any processed foods and you're not salting your food, you may not be consuming enough sodium. But um, in that case, you may want to increase your sodium consumption. Or if you're someone who is sweating a lot, and you're very active, you may have slightly higher sodium needs. But for the average person, we're consuming generally too much sodium. 50% of the population has high blood pressure. High blood pressure is directly responsive to sodium consumption. So if you eat more sodium, your blood pressure goes up. And this is also like LDL cholesterol. It's dependent on genetics, so it doesn't happen with everyone. But in general, on average, more sodium equals higher blood pressure. So if you have high blood pressure, sodium is the most important thing that you can be doing. Reducing your sodium consumption, increasing your potassium consumption are probably the most important things you can do for lowering your blood pressure. And a lot of people are getting high blood pressure from following these recommendations to take supplements like LMNT or Element and these other ones that are 1,000 milligrams of sodium per day when they're already consuming too much sodium. Every time I posted about this, I've had at least 1 to 2 people reach out to me who developed high blood pressure after taking this, and they didn't know, because you don't feel high blood pressure until they went to their doctor, and they had been taking these salt supplements for months. And then they went to their doctor, got it tested, their blood pressure was really high, the doctor's talking to them about medication, and then they're like, maybe I can reduce the salt consumption. I've had multiple people reach out to me and say, I'm glad I found your account because I was taking it, my blood pressure was high, and I stopped and it went down. And this is not surprising. Increasing sodium consumption increases blood pressure. As we mentioned, increasing blood pressure is going to increase your risk of heart disease. So this is um, consuming extra sodium. When if someone's promoting, if they're saying you need to be adding more salt to your diet or you need to be drinking salt, that's not a good general recommendation for the general population. Now, if it's people who have POTS syndrome and they have, it's orthostatic hypotension where they stand up and they get dizzy and they have low blood pressure, those people need to be consuming more sodium. So there's some cases where consuming more sodium is going to be helpful because sodium is necessary for health. And this is where some of this misinformation can get spun, is because too little sodium is going to be harmful for health because it's important for our health. But on the other side of it, consuming too much is also harmful, and people promoting increasing sodium consumption is that's a dangerous message.
Well, and I think that's where we get into so often, humans love stories and we relate to personal experiences and anecdotes so much, which, for us, we call it that N of one, right? Like that, quote unquote, non study on one person. And we get into this really weird back and forth because it is so compelling to hear someone, particularly in a visual medium like Instagram and TikTok. They're young, they quote unquote look healthy, which means they're in a smaller body. They share how active they are and their, salads and their smoothies. And then they say, oh, I also take this because did you realize we need more salt than we think and not enough sodium is harmful? And we instantly take that in on a really deep level and go, wow, this person obviously is a beacon of health and they're telling me this and I believe this, where as the research is ironclad here. Like we know, like there is no controversy in the research when it comes to LDL cholesterol and saturated fat. There's no controversy in the research in terms of hypertension or high blood pressure and sodium. And yet
You
we're
you
like,
know what?
hey, cutie, let's get element.
Yeah, I don't want to interrupt you there, but I
Yeah.
also want to mention that Element, they cherry pick a study and they post it on their site to make it look like sodium needs are higher. So unfortunately for the average consumer, it's hard to see this because it's like, oh, well, they have a study. I, people have told me this multiple times. Well, Element has a study showing that higher people need higher sodium needs, and it's so easy to pick one study to support your whatever that you want to claim. With the LDL cholesterol, I've seen a specific study cited multiple times where they measured people's LDL cholesterol when they were going into the hospital. And the people who had higher LDL cholesterol lived longer. And a lot of people will cite this study. And it's like because these people were going into the hospital in under very extremely stressful conditions where the worse health you're in at that point, the lower your LDL cholesterol is. It's just the way that our body works. It's not that the LDL cholesterol is protecting these people. It's just it's a the way that our body responds to things, and you can cherry pick a study to say anything. And this is what LMNT did on their site. Is they have that one study that's just cherry picked to say that, oh, sodium needs are higher than we thought. It's from like 12 years ago, and we have like multiple review papers and meta analyses that have been published on sodium consumption and cardiovascular disease since then. And the fact that they pick one study to show in on the topic that has extensive research on it is a red flag. But it's really hard for I understand that for the average consumer, you see a study and then you hear someone like Andrew Huberman who promotes it, who talks about this stuff, and it's like, oh, this guy's a scientist, he's talking about this study must be valid. It's impossible, really, like for the average person to be able to identify that as like misleading. I feel for people trying to navigate in this space, and that's why I address these things, because I see how difficult it can be to understand when these things are not pointing you in the right direction.
Yeah, which is why, so often for people, one of my main pieces of advice when they see me one on one is that they need to unfollow as much nutrition advice, including me, if if I'm adding to it, as possible on the internet. But I like because you post like on your account on one of your highlights, you have a people to follow. And so if people are really wanting to engage with nutrition on the internet and say, how do I know who to trust? I would highly recommend that people go to your highlight because you have sort of vetted these very evidence-based professionals who are, talking about the science and giving actually helpful advice.
Yeah, yeah, and I put that together for that reason because I mean the biggest barrier for a lot of people, a lot of my clients, even was just trying to make sense of so many different sources of information. And they'd hear something from me and they'd say, oh, but so and so said this, and this person's an MD, and so now I can say, look, these people are all nutrition professionals. This is
Yeah.
what they do. They're all saying the same stuff. We're all saying the same stuff. Like in this is nutrition professionals. The other people that you're learning from, none of them are nutrition professionals. Like very few of them have a degree in nutrition. It's MDs and chiropractors and journalists and anyone else who is charismatic and who can tell a good story around this topic.
Yeah. Before we head into the rapid fire, I want to ask one last question, very much in sort of this vein of the internet back and forth about like what diet is best. So you've got the paleo folks and the keto folks, and then the full up carnivore folks, and then of course us plant based and vegans adding our 2 cents to the ring. What does, in terms of heart health and cardiovascular health specifically, what does the research tell us about overall diet? So, more like dietary patterns and heart health.
Truly, you're probably in the best camp to be in when it comes to heart health. That's why I eat mostly plant based diet, because that's my my family history is heart disease, and I know
Mhm.
that this is probably the most important thing that I need to focus on. And um, yeah, when it comes to heart health and reducing LDL cholesterol to the greatest degree, controlling blood pressure, probably the more plant-based you can go is the better, to be honest. And I'm saying this not from a biased perspective, because I'm not completely plant-based. But yeah, that direction, because it's more fiber, less saturated fat, more micronutrients, from the plant foods that protect our blood vessels against damage as well. So like, um, yeah, the that direction of more plant-based, making sure that you're getting enough protein and making sure that you're meeting your nutrient needs in a more plant-based diet is the important thing. Because a lot oftentimes, because it's going to have a negative impact on your cardiovascular health, not directly, but indirectly through blood glucose control. If you're not eating enough protein, you lose muscle over time, and that negatively affects your metabolism. So that's why, the protein's important. Make sure that you're getting plenty of protein on a more plant-based diet. I would say would be the optimal approach.
Yeah, and I'll enjoy the quick bath in the echo chamber for a second. But I also think it's really important for folks to hear too, because, even sort of from a personal level, like I live in a family of omnivores. And as a vegan, I recognize that 8 billion people are not going to go vegan, nor is it appropriate, affordable, or accessible to all people. And so my mission is that if I'm raising two little omnivores who think they don't eat meat 3 meals a day, that like plants are part of an omnivorous diet, I think that's the win. And I think that's the really accessible win for everybody, because there's no giving anything up. There's no, they can eat the foods they've always grown up with, recognizing that you're just shifting the balance of power, maybe we can call it, on your plate, is that there's lots and lots of plants and then whatever else you like in there.
Yeah, and actually for me, going plant-based was really helpful for me, because it helped me to learn how to include more vegetables, more plant-based proteins. So like, it forced me to learn how to manage without animal foods. And now I mean, I like you said, I probably have them once a day. I mean, I'll have, a yogurt as a snack, but typically in my meals, I have at least 1 to 2 vegetarian meals per day, and I'm able to get enough protein, and I know how to do that because of that. Whereas the average person would be, you're kind of lost, in terms of like getting enough protein and making sure that you're meeting your needs. Because when I first went plant based, I lost muscle. I mean, I lost weight and muscle because I was whole food plant based. I wasn't eating any processed food whatsoever, and I cannot eat enough at my size on that. Like, with the
Yeah.
amount of fiber that comes along with everything, like I just wasn't able to eat enough and lost a bunch of weight. And it's like, it's a matter of like really being, informed in the way that you do things, and really doing it in an intentional way, that I think is the most important.
Yeah. One, it's why I write recipes. Like that was never on my like career trajectory when I started. I was like, I like science. I want to be sciencey. But I recognize that people don't know what we can hear all these things about nutrients, and then we're still not like 4 p.m. I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to make for dinner tonight, like how to make that happen. But then the other thing I feel like I need to put a plug into, because you see clients one on one, is like, this is why individualized counseling is so important. We can get all this information and fill our brains with all this information, but we're still like, what does this mean for me? Like, how do I go plant based and meet my individual needs, make sure I maintain my muscle mass? Like, this is why we see someone one on one.
Yeah, definitely. And so the other part of that, so I just am like launching a course right now, and as this comes out, I probably, be a few months out from that. But um I map all of this out in as much detail as I possibly can in there, and then have like meal plans and everything, so that, because not everyone is going to work one on one, and it can be quite expensive to work one on one with a dietitian or a nutrition professional. And so my goal with that is to really put all of this information together, and so that people can go through the process on their own, because you have to go through the process whether or not you're doing it with someone or on your own. You have to go through this process of learning how to do all of this and learning how to apply it into your life. And you have to have the right information first, though. And a lot of people are trying to go through the process, but they have the wrong information, and they're, cutting out seed oils, and then cutting out gluten this week, and then, fasting the next week. And it's doing all these things that aren't going to move the needle. And
Mm.
if you have the right information to move the needle, and you can go through a process of focusing on, okay, now I'm going to, like you said, I'm going to take away one meal of, I'm going to eat one more plant-based meal per day, and have some recipes for that, and understand how to do that in a way that works for you. Sometimes I I like people to work with someone and get the individualized approach, but I also know that most people aren't. And having that right information and going through this process on your own of trial and error of constructing something that works for you that meets your needs, because that's the important thing. People ask me all the time, what's the best diet? The best diet is the one that meets your nutrient needs, meets your energy needs, meets your nutrient needs, that you can sustain over the long period of time. And so starting off with understanding your nutrient energy needs, and then seeing, okay, these are the different ways I can meet them, what's going to work best for me. And that takes, some trial and error, and a process for sure.
That's the perfect last word. So let's shift into the rapid fire questions. Some easy little softballs like, what's your go-to breakfast?
Smoothie pretty much every day.
What do you put in your smoothie?
Berries, put a little bit of peanut butter, protein powder, flaxseed. What else do I put in there? Sometimes banana, sometimes other things as well. But that's the go-to that's been my go-to for over a decade now.
Awesome. Sweet or savory?
Savory.
A nutrition myth that you actually used to believe?
Pretty much all of them, but fasting is one that I did a lot of back in the day.
Okay. Um, we talked about this already. A supplement that you think is actually helpful for most people.
Vitamin D.
Perfect. What would be your next dream vacation? Money, no object.
Ooh. Probably, because I've been wanting to do this for a while, is go to the jungle in Costa Rica with my son.
Amazing. Dr. Adrian Chavez, thank you so, so much for your time and your expertise here. I hope that after this episode, people are really thinking about heart health, not as an afterthought, but as like part of their way of operating this world.
Definitely. Thank you for having me.